Catholic Education Sandhurst acknowledges the traditional owners of the land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
What happens when a life of public service meets the mission of Catholic education? In this episode of Catholic Education Matters, host Kate Fogarty is joined by Jacinta Collins, Executive Director of the National Catholic Education Commission, for a rich and reflective conversation on leadership, legacy and the future of Catholic education in Australia. As Jacinta prepares to retire from her role, she shares insights from a remarkable career spanning politics, advocacy and education. From her early days in the Labor movement and Australian Parliament, to leading the national body that represents more than 1,700 Catholic schools and nearly 800,000 students. Together, Kate and Jacinta explore the journey from social work and politics to Catholic education leadership, the mission and role of the NCEC in shaping national education policy, the evolution of unity and purpose across Catholic education, how faith formation, teacher efficacy and access to early learning are shaping the next generation, and Jacinta's hopes for the future and why every decision still begins with the student. Whether you're an educator, school leader or part of the broader Catholic community, this episode offers a heartfelt look at the people and purpose behind Catholic education in Australia. Now join us as we explore what truly matters in education.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our next edition of Catholic Education Matters. My name's Kate Fogarty. I'm the Executive Director of Catholic Education Sandhurst. And today we're fortunate enough to have with us Jacinta Collins. And for those of you who haven't met Jacinta before or seen her around the traps, Jacinta is the Executive Director of the National Catholic Education Commission. So she has been running the peak body for Catholic education throughout Australia for several years now and has recently announced her retirement. So it's a real pleasure to have time with Jacinta now. Hi, Jacinta.
It's great to be with you, Kate.
Jacinta, I think it is great for everybody to have a chance just to hear a little of your story because it is fascinating how you came into Catholic education and the skills you brought. So take us right back when you were back at school. What was the career you thought you were going to end up in and what happened after that?
Kate, when I was in my school days, I don't suppose I had a set career that I thought I was going to take, other than a sense I'd like to make a contribution. So I had a fairly vague idea that I'd like to do something like social work. I hit a sliding doors moment when I was at university and my philosophy lecturers wanted me to go on and pursue logic, go to Oxford, go down that path. But instead I stayed in social work. But while I was studying, I was also working in the Labor movement and making a contribution there. So school days, probably still embedded to some extent in Catholic social traditions. I wanted to do something that was going to make a contribution to the world at large.
And you had quite an extraordinary political career. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? In fact, how you came into that and then what that experience was like for you and how that continued to form you as somebody who's eventually ended up in Catholic education?
Well, that political career started in the Labor movement. So I worked within the trade union movement for about 15 years before I moved into what we call the political wing as opposed to the industrial wing of the Labor movement. And it was possibly in my earlier days in the Labor movement, I got a solid grounding through Catholic social action in social principles, priorities with respect to worker rights, but also more broadly other social action initiatives that the church is still very keen in. And after 15 years there, I moved into, again, I describe it as the political wing because it's very embedded in ongoing activity within the Labor Party. And from my days in the Labor movement, also whilst I was studying, I developed from there. I like to recall that possibly the first piece of legislation I dealt with was for single mothers working in the retail industry. When they became injured, the means testing of their pension was much more severe. And back in the days, early days of the Labor Accord, we were able to fix that for parents working within our sector and across the board so that if their income now came from workers' compensation, they didn't lose a significant amount of it. That was back when Brian Howe was minister. And I was possibly only about 20 years of age at the time. So I've always had an interest in what can be achieved more broadly in society to make things fairer.
Fantastic. And, eventually the political career came to an end and you were looking around for something else. Did you come straight into Catholic education at that time, or was there something in between there?
Oh, Kate, I wasn't looking actually. I had shared with someone that was Labor to be elected back in 2019. I would stay around in Parliament possibly only for another couple more years, and was looking at how I could spend more time with my family, particularly my husband and my mother. And I suggested a candidate for the role that I'm filling now, and had people come back to me and say, well, actually, we want to try and convince you to do it. So unlike some in politics, I didn't lose office, so to speak. I made an intentional decision to move out of political life into Catholic education. But it was also an extension, some might say providence, of what I've been doing for about the last 10 years. So I had, since the early stages of, or possibly even earlier, the Gonski education reforms, and a bit earlier actually, because I was chairing the Senate Education Committee. I'd been building an understanding of education more broadly. And when the funding disputes started in Catholic education in around about, actually it was earlier, probably during the Gonski period, part of my role was to ensure that Labor did not undermine the role of non-government schools in education in Australia as part of the overall Gonski reforms. You may, or some people might remember the Mark Latham initiatives and his 100 schools hit list and things like that. That was burnt into the memory of some of my colleagues, and the role I'd been given was to make sure we didn't revisit that. So probably since around about 2010, I'd been working pretty heavily in education and specifically non-government schools education policy. So moving into Catholic education was providentially, I suppose, an extension of what I'd been doing in education policy in Parliament, but also my connection to Catholic education, the Catholic Church, across a range of other areas too. I think of Catholic education probably as about the third chapter of my vocation. First one in the Labor movement, second one in Parliament, and then now in Catholic education.
Thanks for that, Jacinta. I think there'd be a lot of people listening to the podcast today, a lot of teachers and perhaps even leaders in schools who might not have a sense of what the NCEC actually does. So could you take a few moments and just share with us what a day looks like for you? But beyond that, what are the big ticket items, the things that you've been working on over your years in the role, the things where you think NCEC has really made a difference to Catholic education across Australia?
No day's the same, but much of my time in Parliament and other areas has been like that in my career. I have fairly limited routine. That said, a pretty strong strategic focus, and it wouldn't be surprising if people didn't understand what the National Catholic Education Commission is. The character of how Catholic education is delivered is fairly complex. I sometimes joke it's like having a federation on a federation. We have enough trouble citizenship-wise helping people understand the character of our parliamentary world. For Catholic education, we've got all of the states and territories who have a fairly significant role in the regulation of education, but we also have the federal government. So my job is to represent the interests of Catholic education with the federal government. And why is that important? It's important because the federal government is, for Catholic education, our principal funder. So by a long shot, probably around about 65% of our funding comes from the federal government. And the next amount, probably about the 25%, comes from the parents that pay fees for their children to attend our schools and Catholic communities. And then the last share is the state government. Whereas if you look at regulation and teaching standards and issues like that, a fair amount of that occurs at the state government level. So it's very important for us to work with all of our state and territories to maintain our unity in representing the interests of Catholic education across Australia.
And of course, one of the things people would perhaps know NCEC best for is the Magnificent Conference, which just happened recently up in Cairns. And I know a lot of Catholic school teachers and leaders are speaking very highly of the wonderful experience they had at this year's conference.
Yeah, it was a great conference. I was very pleased. It's possibly one of the larger big things that I'm doing in this role. The other big thing, going back to your earlier question, was the federal election and representing Catholic education within that. Another issue that people working in schools and in classrooms may not be aware, because of all the talk around government school funding and those agreements only recently being landed, the funding arrangements for non-government schools are in a 10-year agreement, and that's been running since 2020 until the end of 2029. So we've got relative funding certainty, and we reached our, well, I wouldn't call it the full Gonski, which is some of the language that's been used in the government school campaigns, but we reached our share of the full Gonski back in 2023. And now, fortunately, government schools are on their path to get to what was characterised as the full Gonski, or the full schooling resource standard. But for them, that won't happen until in the early 2030s. But people often forget that in our funding, ours is means tested. It's adjusted according to the income of the families in our schools, not the case in government schools. And that adjustment usually comes in across the board at around about 25%. So government schools may not have the full Gonski, but we lose 25% of our resource standard almost immediately by the means testing that's in the funding model.
It's frustrating, isn't it? It's such a tricky thing to explain to people, and it can be so easily caricatured by other people in the debate as if we get the full amount and somehow receive more than our fair share, rather than acknowledging straight up 25% comes out straight away, and then the means testing. So I imagine for you, it's something you are repeatedly explaining to people. Jacinta, thank you for that. I'm interested in your personal leadership journey, and who are the people, what were the moments or the learnings that formed you as a leader? Because you have had a profound impact, not just on Catholic education, on, as you say, on Australian policy and life more broadly over a long and distinguished career. You've spoken a little bit about Catholic social teaching and some of the learnings that you've done there, but who are the people that led you into that, or who are the giants of your story who are the little voice in the back of your head or the angel on your shoulder calling you to something more and better?
Oh, I'd have to say I've got good fortune of many, Kate, so it's hard to identify any particular ones. One I am fond to recall is a chap by the name of Jim Ma. He was the secretary of the Shop Assistants Union when I started there as a young person. And his leadership and engagement was very significant in my early development, and it ranged from lunchtime 500 card games through to discussions of the day and exposure to the broader political environment. I can still remember the day he introduced me to Bob Hawke when he was addressing an event. I had an office near his at some points, and I would often hear the nature and the character of some of the conversations of a world well beyond what I might otherwise have been exposed to. So that opportunity at a time when, when I started working in the labour movement, there were very, very few women, even in a highly feminised industry such as retail, working in that type of work. So the confidence and the engagement was really important, but then also an institutional arrangement back then that connected you to broader philosophical, theological thinking and how that connected to day-to-day affairs. I'd be struggling to think of something similar that exists today, which is quite sad. Possibly in our schools, in our school leadership formation, and that's why that's so important and critical, because it doesn't really appear to be occurring to any great extent elsewhere.
I think you're right. I think, in fact, if nothing else, I think Catholic social teaching and those big challenging ideas that we're called to hold in balance when we're making decisions, I think that is actually one thing we do really well in not just with our staff, but also with our students. It's something that lands. It's something that resonates with everyone. It's hard to escape that your conscience, is really pricked by knowing those bigger principles and understanding what they are and understanding how they play out in tricky ways in real life for people and for systems and, organisations. So, I think you're right. Schools might be one of the last bastions for adults and for young people where those big ideas are explored and where there's space to explore them and, laugh about it but cry about some of it too.
Yeah. I still remember when I was introduced to the principle of subsidiarity. Interesting word. Okay, what does that mean? Immediately for me was the balance with solidarity, and what is the appropriate balance, and that subsidiarity is used appropriately, not just as an excuse. And that was very, very early days. So it's great to be talking about it now, because you don't often reflect how much of what you might do automatically now comes from the exposure you've had many, many years ago.
Yeah, and I can imagine in a role like yours, it actually is playing out quite a bit. Where do you hold things to the centre, because that's where it's necessarily and best done, and where do you devolve that to other people at other levels or other institutions or other organisations, because that is the right thing to do, even if it brings tensions into the system.
Yeah, and my joke about being a federation on a federation is that we're a relatively loose federation, in Catholic education particularly, but also in the broader parliamentary system. Within Catholic education, we've got 25 different authorities as operators of schools, without even considering the 20% of our students that are in religious institute schools. It's a pretty broad network. And one of the nicest things, Kate, I think I've heard in the announcement around my retirement is the appreciation from those across our network for the level of engagement and connection, and that we have been embracing the diversity of how we deliver education.
Yeah, that's a lovely thing to hear, isn't it? A great affirmation. I think it's one of the funniest things, isn't it, when in the media or somewhere else they refer to the Catholic Church as if we are one organisation and one body. Of course, there's a lot that we get on the same page around, but there is a lot of diversity in who we are as well, and different governance and different structures within a whole range of different entities across the Catholic Church. Let's go to Catholic education then, Jacinta. You've had a bird's eye view on who we are and what we do for a number of years now. I'm interested in what you're seeing evolving in Catholic education, or what for you is exciting or giving a bit of energy and free air that perhaps wasn't there 5 or 6 years ago, or something that you're just starting to see some grassroots emerging around. What's intriguing you in that space?
I think the rewarding and exciting part is the unity I was just talking about. When I stepped into this role, we came out of a fairly fractious period around arguing around how we should be funded, and some of that was internal. It wasn't all external as well. So a unity of purpose, I think, is exciting. Being able to, as we just discussed, hold loosely together but united is what I think is necessary for the way in which we are organised. I see a stronger sense of our purpose or our mission. I see a stronger understanding that our mission is twofold. It's not only the more than 200 years of Catholic education in Australia to deliver quality education because of its transformative power and its power to develop the human person, but I also see a growing sense of enlivening the faith formation of those students as well. And that's what I call our dual mission. It's transmission of faith as well as high quality education. Our strategic priorities probably partly represent that, where we talk about enlivening faith formation, we talk about improving excellence in educational excellence, and we talk about ensuring access to a Catholic education, reaching right back to the 1800s, where the Australian bishops decided that their ambition was to have a Catholic school in every community to ensure that Catholic families could have access to a Catholic education. Didn't mean they were exclusively Catholic. They weren't. We've offered a fairly universal offering, and quite happy to embrace those that want a faith-based education that don't necessarily come from a Catholic tradition or no tradition. But being a major provider of education in Australia leaves Australian Catholic education as probably about the strongest in the world.
One of the incredible things about Catholic education that we're celebrating just this year is the 60 years since the closeout of Vatican II. And there's a lot of discussion around about how far we've come and just what a different landscape our schools are in than 60 years ago. Of course, the world's changed in so many ways, but so has education. I don't know if you get a chance to drop into schools or if you hear a lot of stories coming out of schools. I'm wondering what gives you hope in what you see actually happening on the ground in schools today? I know you're mostly operating at that, the national and the higher level, but what gives you joy in what you see happening in Catholic schools around Australia at the moment?
Kate, I get into schools, not only Catholic schools, across a whole range of areas. I was only in the States a few weeks back in some of their schools too. And we were exploring liberal arts, and I prefer the expression the Catholic intellectual tradition, and how well that might be delivered. And alongside some others who were at this conference, we were thinking about our own Catholic education, and mine was relatively limited to fairly rote RE. What I see in schools today now is enlivening the faith formation of our students, we hope, for the future. Some of our measurement still highlights the proportion of young people in our schools who pray, despite what you might hear in secular terms. And it gives us great hope for enlivening the faith of future Australians. The other issue I saw recently that probably fits into the green shoots space you asked a moment ago was an understanding around the importance of the quality of teaching, enhancing student outcomes. And this was a discussion at the National Teacher Workforce Roundtable. And one of the key issues highlighted by the people in the room, including teachers, with respect to teacher wellbeing, was teacher efficacy and how we better support teacher efficacy. That's the other green shoot, I suppose I see at the moment. And aligned quite strongly to two of our strategic priorities. I'd like to see the third, and early education is probably an example of that. The third one is how do we improve the access of young people to our schools, and governments and ourselves deciding to support the early education before 5-year-old schooling of young people is an important arm of our access strategic priority, and the green shoots are happening there.
They sure are. Lots of great early learning centres opening up right around the country. I think as you were talking then, I was thinking about the way so many Catholic systems at the moment really are leading in that space of teacher efficacy and are really using the power of the sense of system that they exist within to support teachers to have the best resources in their hands and the best learning available to them, so that the impact of what they're doing really is the most dramatic that it can be for the young people in our care. So I do think you're right there that Catholic education has a real part to play and is already leading the way in thinking about how do we build the capacity of our teachers, knowing that, so many of them have come from such diverse university experiences that depending what their early formative years are in the profession, that can really accelerate their capacity as teachers, or it can actually hinder it. So what can we do to cut through that? How can we make sure there's a level playing field for every teacher in every classroom to really impact for every student? So yeah, thank you for drawing attention to that. And I do think that is something that's happened under your watch, is the sense of system, the sense of we have the capacity to really impact change for our teachers is highly enabled across Catholic education, which is very exciting for everybody. Jacinta, as somebody who's been one of our preeminent leaders in Catholic education for a number of years now, I'm interested in, as you come to the end of this phase of your career and moving into something new, what's the advice that you have, or the tips or the tricks or the positive affirmation that you have for teachers who are coming through who might be looking to step into leadership roles? And I'm probably thinking of those, looking for their first position of leadership, through to those who are already operating deputy principals and principals and might be thinking about system leadership. What's some words of wisdom you have for those people?
I think I'd pin it down to one word, Kate, which is investment. Invest yourself. And that can happen in just a myriad of ways. It happened to the young me when I was invested in understanding how I might make a contribution to the world around me. But it involves that energy, that investment. It's about understanding the environment you're within, understanding and exploring how you might be able to improve it. The contra to that approach is the risk, I suppose, for Catholic education, which is complacency. So for a younger teacher or someone working within Catholic education who strives to make a contribution to our broader mission, it would be invest yourself. Find the myriad of ways in which you can invest yourself in doing so, and build confidence in your capacity to do that. Find the people who are doing so themselves and can share their experiences with you, and there'll be many of them, but I suppose that intentional investment is the advice I'd give.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jacinta, I'm curious, if you could change one thing about Catholic education today, what would that be?
Well, I mentioned complacency, but I think that's on the road to changing. I think the self-awareness, the understanding both within and outside of Catholic education of who we are, what we strive to do, what we achieve. At the national level, we're still looking at our own branding, our promotional work that needs to occur. It's one thing to go out and say, we need better funding. It's another thing for people to understand why, and that why is one of the main areas we need to get better at.
It's really interesting that, that's an internal reflection, isn't it? It's very easy to say we need to get our voice out there or we need to make sure everybody knows who we are. But doing that work to start with, to really understand who we are and what we do and what's great about that, and why it's worth protecting and why it's worth expanding and growing is the first piece of work. I guess the flip side of that question is, what's your hope for Catholic education into the future? If we were having this conversation again in 10 years' time, 15, 20 years' time, what would you hope to see in place?
Well, I hope it will continue to grow. I'd like to see Catholic education grow in harmony with our Catholic communities that essentially built our system. So the connection between school and parish is something that I think could grow to the mutual benefit. And when I say growth, I don't necessarily mean more bums in seats type growth. I mean growth in respect of our mission, our understanding of what we do and why, quality of what we're delivering in our schools, that we are building the schools for the future. And I imagine a completely different world to how many in the church felt after the Royal Commission, that we have an enlivened mission in Catholic education and a strong confidence in our role in Australian society.
Jacinta, at the end of all of our Catholic Education Matters podcast, we just ask one simple question of every person. From everything that we have spoken about today, what matters most?
The students. And I suppose that is grounded in Catholic social teaching, the inherent dignity of every child in our care and delivering the best quality of support for those children and the benefits of their faith flourishing and seeing that in the faces of all of those children, which is, again, why even though I'm many, many, many steps removed from the operations of a school, I still love going into schools. That is what matters.
Thank you. And Jacinta, I think that element of what you do, the visiting the schools as well as the advocacy at the higher levels, will certainly be missed by us all. And on behalf of all of us here at Catholic Education Sandhurst, but I think more broadly across Catholic education in Australia, thank you for your service to us and for your leadership of us and your wrangling of us, I think, in some ways too. That unity that you spoke of, that sense of we actually are one community together, is largely because of the work that you and your team have done, but you in particular. So all the very best for a wonderful retirement. I'm sure this won't be the end of us hearing from you. There's lots more for you to contribute, and we will look forward to seeing what that is into the future. Thanks very much, Jacinta Collins.
Thank you, Kate.
That's it for this episode of Catholic Education Matters. Make sure to follow the show and share it with someone who's passionate about learning, leadership and community. You can also leave a review or connect with us online at Catholic Education Sandhurst. Until next time, stay with us as we explore what truly matters in education.